You're listening to the Bail in the Midwest podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we explore a variety of topics related to bail, pretrial release, and the criminal justice system in the Midwest. My name is Shane Rolf. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Kansas Bail Agents Association, and I've worked in this field for the past 35 years. There are certain personalities in the bail bond industry who really stand out, and these standout people can have an outsized influence on all of us in the bail bond industry. My guest today is just such an outlier, Armando Roche. Armando, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you here this morning.
If you could give us just a brief synopsis of your background in bail, and then maybe we can drill down to that a little bit further.
Well, I originally got in the bail business back in '64. I was in it from '64 to '67. And in '67, I went to work with Hillsborough County Government Division of Welfare, and was with them until I wanted to get a college degree at night. So I was with them until I graduated in '71 and stayed with the county till '75. In '75, I decided to go back in the bail bond business and obtain a license again, and been in it ever since.
We don't really get the whole go into the Department of Welfare and then come back into bail. A lot of times the people that come from government into bail come from more of a law enforcement bent. Let's knock out a couple of things first. I know that you're based in Tampa, Florida, and the hurricane just recently kind of tore through your area. Hopefully all your family and agents and everybody down there have come through this okay.
Well, I'm in Tampa, and we're 120 miles from Fort Myers, but our Fort Myers agents, some of them have gotten hit pretty hard. Yes.
Well, hopefully they'll pull through it. I mean, and this is a little tongue in cheek, but I guess given that you've just had a hurricane blow through your town, we should assume that your failure to appear rate is going to now skyrocket for the next 2 to 3 years, like it did in Houston after their hurricane.
Let's hope not.
Well, I mean, obviously that's more than a little sarcastic, but given that the Arnold Foundation just paid for a study that essentially said that exact same thing, that the hurricane in Harris County increased their failure to appear rate, and they've never really recovered. Anyway, probably the hurricane that you've dealt with the most that I was paid most attention to was the Chiefs Buccaneers game that just happened this past weekend. And I see in the background here, we can't see it on the podcast, but on the video, looks like that is the Buccaneer Stadium behind you.
It is. It's right behind us there, across the street from our main headquarters here in Tampa.
Well, I know that Super Bowl loss, kind of smarts here still in Kansas City, but last week felt pretty good. But I'm sure things will. Hopefully, this won't be the last time that Brady and Mahomes get to play each other.
Well, let's hope they start winning.
Well, for the Buccaneers anyway.
Yeah.
So we'd originally discussed doing this podcast a couple months ago, and we at that point in time we were going to discuss bail and politics, and we will definitely discuss that today as well. But I kind of wanted to go in a little bit of a different direction first. A couple weeks ago, I was volunteered by the KBAA to sit on a panel discussion about bail reform put on by the Wichita, Kansas Racial Profiling Advisory Board. And, it was pretty obvious that was not going to be a pro-bail group. So anyway, the night before, I drove down and I was killing time in the hotel room so I could attend this thing the following day. And I ended up watching a program called Bloomberg Wealth with David Rubenstein. And Rubenstein was doing interviews with several wealthy business peoples and movers and shakers. And it kind of struck me that the bail bond industry deserves to have a little bit of flattery heaped upon it, upon some of its movers and shakers as well. So I'd like to delve into your personal story a little bit, because you really are one of the movers and shakers in the industry, certainly compared to, those standalone single shop people like myself. Now, as bondsmen, we like to think of ourselves as entrepreneurs, and we are, of course, as all small businessmen really are entrepreneurs. But there's a fundamental difference between the guy who owns a burger joint and Dave Thomas, who founded Wendy's. And there's a fundamental difference between somebody like me who has a single shop and a handful of employees, and someone like Armando Roche, who's created a nationally spanning insurance company. So let's kind of get into your background a little bit. Am I correct? I think I've heard that you were actually born in Spain.
No, I'm a third generation Floridian.
Okay, but your background is Spain or Spanish.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
My-
So I got the story wrong
grandparents-
just a little bit, though.
My grandparents came here from Spain.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, well, on my mother's side, on my dad's side, my grandfather was born in Key West in 1890.
Ah, so
We've been in
yeah,
Florida for a while.
I see. Florida. I mean, I love Florida. We actually we've got a vacation spot we go to that's probably underwater right now. There, just north of Fort Myers, that we go to. Every 3 years.
Well, we're finding a lot of people from California and New York are also beginning to love Florida.
Probably for different reasons, though.
Well, it's reasons that they probably created themselves.
Well, I mean, that is the story is don't California my Florida, or don't California my Texas. These transplants, just like, if you want to come here and enjoy the system we have, leave your old system, back in
Absolutely.
California. Now, as you mentioned before, you were going to college, and you were pursuing, I think, a sociology degree.
Yes.
When you initially got into the bail bond industry. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because that is kind of an unusual intro to bail bonds. Like I said before, that's normally not the angle you go. It's generally the people that are opposed to bail that have those sociology degrees.
Right. Well, I got very disappointed with county government. I was with a Head Start program and several other programs that were offshoots of the political structure, I guess, across the country, or political philosophy across the country at the time, with the poverty programs. I spent some time in Dallas. I was there about 2 months as a staff trainer with the Dallas County Community Action Agency. Came back to Tampa after several months there, and went back to work with Hillsborough County, and became very disappointed with the whole setup. That's when I resigned my position, and I was sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table, and I told her that I had planned on going back in the bail business and wanted to start my own agency, but there was one problem. I was broke. And she said, "Well, I've been saving a little money for you," and gave me 2 insurance policies for $1,000 apiece. My hatred of insurance companies came when I went to cash them, and they told me they were only worth $250 apiece. So I cashed them in and got back in the bail bond business, opened up an office, still have that $500 in the bank account, and started my own agency. I had a friend that was in the business, and he said, "Well, if you get back in again, I will split my business with you, but you have to work every night from 11 to 7 in the morning, and I'll split the bonds 50-50 with you, providing that you get involved in helping us with the legal laws and legislature that's taking place in Tallahassee." And he said that would have to be the commitment you'd make. So I did. I took him up on it. Been doing it ever since. He passed away a number of years ago, but I still feel that obligation. So that's why we're here today.
Well, I know that, and this is, talking about me a little bit rather than you, but I know that when I first got into bail, it was in 1986, in the spring of 1986, and that was just at the end of the closing of our legislature, because our legislature, I'm not sure about Florida, but ours basically only operates from January to the end of April, 1st of May. And then they're off for the rest of the year. But in 1986, during that time, there'd been a big fight to kind of beat back 10% deposit bail that I was not really involved with, but I was aware of. But then, 3 years later, it was back up to the legislature, and it seems like I've been going up to the legislature, every year, since 88, 89, to talk about bail, or to fight off something, or to try and change something that would be beneficial, or change something that would be harmful to us. It really is a learning curve. I mean, figuring out how to talk to people on that. And I'm more of an introverted person anyway. So, I'm not real gregarious and outgoing, that you would have to be to actually talk to those people. So, having a lobbyist along those lines is always a good thing. So
let me bring you up to date on something. Actually, that 10% goes back even further than the 80s. In the 60s, it's I believe it's when it began. When I got back into the business in 75, they were attempting to do that in Florida. And prior to that, in Florida, it was called the Faircloth Bill, which was a 10% bill. And you had some states that fell into that 10%. You had, for example, I think it was in 64, you had Illinois, Kentucky, that went 10%. You had a few other states. But in Florida, that was part of what they were trying to keep out at the time. And in 1981, the governor of Florida at the time, Governor Graham, appointed me and different constitutional officers to a bail reform commission. And what we did in that commission, and I got to tell you, if they'd have taken the vote the first day that we met, the vote would have been to eliminate bail in Florida. But after at the end of the year that the commission was in studying this whole issue, we looked at where the problems were, and instead of eliminating the industry, we corrected the problems. And I think that that's what happens in a lot of states. You form these different groups, and they're out to eliminate the industry, but they don't really know why. So I think that they need to take a hard look at what's working and what's not working, and change what's not working, rather than just eliminate the option of bail that the judges have now.
Well, then there's a question of, if it really is not working, because and we'll get into this probably a little bit further, but we've seen in the places where they've, decided to go this experiment that things haven't gone well.
Right. Well, in 1981, a group of us formed, and I'm proud to say I was one of the co-founders, together with Jack Whitlock and some other big names in the industry, formed the Professional Bail Agents of the United States. And because we felt that we had to come together and unite against these false narratives that were being put out about the bail industry, and the fact that they were in a sense abusive to poor people. But that has been I think an organization that's worked very hard at letting people know the truth of what actually occurs in the criminal justice system.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question that PBUS has been, very important. Just look, I think was it Gerald Monks was in Houston and in Harris County. And that was almost exclusively a catch and release program there at the time. And they finally rolled that back and saw their crime rates drop off. And now we're back to that cycle of, oh, now we got to let everybody go. And now we're seeing those crime rates spike back up again. So let's get back to you just a little bit. You basically, your agency, you started from just the bail bond, unless the legislative perspective. You started your agency there with your partner in Tampa proper.
Well, I didn't have a partner. It was
you were working nights.
Yeah, he had an agency, been in the business for years, and made me that offer. He was getting up there in age, and he wanted someone to help his sons who were actually in the business too. But the night shift was a primary one he wanted me to take care of. Yes.
So one of my old competitors here, who actually just passed away here about a month ago, in his mid-90s, he was in the retail business prior to getting to bail, and he routinely complained that he had started his retail discount business at the same time as Sam Walton. And
yeah.
And of course, despite his success locally, his discount score did not become Walmart, and his bail bond business remained local. So as someone who's made that leap, how does one make the leap from bail bond agency to bail bond underwriter on a nationwide scale? How do you make that leap there? I mean, obviously we're not all going to do that, but some of the best of us have made that leap from, okay, I'm a local agent to now I've got agents all over the country operating in this.
Well, I was in and still have the retail bail agency here in Tampa, but it was a 10-year leap from the time I started it. 10 years later, I became a general agent for one of the insurance carriers here in Florida. And then 10 years after that, I formed a general agency in that 10-year, once I hit that 10-year period. And then 10 years later is when I was fortunate enough to buy an insurance company that was being auctioned off by the RTC at the time. I don't know if you remember when the banks were having problems back in '96, and I bid on it and won the bid, and that's when I went from the general agency to the insurance company. So I now operate on three levels: the retail office in Tampa, the general agency that's around the country, and the insurance company that's in 40 states.
I had looked at trying to go into a second line of work at one point in time and looked at various franchise opportunities. And so I'd met with some people that are offering different franchises and stuff like that, more retail. And one of the things that they talked to me about was, well, we don't really like self-employed people, type A personalities. We want those corporate, middle manager type people that want to leave the corporate, but are used to that corporate structure, so that when, we can just plug them in and they can operate these franchises for us. So if someone comes to you, and I know that we've got some Roche agents in my area as well, but when someone comes to you and says, hey, I'd like to be a bondsman, I'd like to start my own agency, what are the factors you look at when you're deciding whether or not to take on a new agent or new agency, to actually be an individual bond writer, if someone wanted to do that?
Well, one of Florida is highly structured when it comes to educational requirements, more so probably than any other state in the country. They have to have 120 hours of classroom study. They have to participate as a temporary bail agent for a number of months, 12 months. They have to continue, they have continuing education courses that we've started. So I look first, do they have the proper credentials? And then you look at the background of the individual, and the background doesn't necessarily mean that they have money. Their character is very important. For example, you don't want to sign up someone to work for your company if that person has a drug problem or has had problems. And if they've had problems with the law, of course, before you can get a license in Florida, they have to pass a vigorous fingerprint check and through law enforcement and so forth before they can even allowed to take the test. So it just depends on the state and the regulations in that state. But you become very astute in the bail business in making judgment calls on characters. I guess we're between the good, the bad, and the ugly. So you have to characterize it appropriately. And sometimes, it's a hit and miss thing, but we've been fortunate that we have done better with the agents that we've accepted, and we don't accept all. This week alone, we turned down, my office is telling me we turned down 3 people. We just don't feel that we're suited to the corporate structure that we've set up.
Well, I recall back, when I first came into business was about the same time that Allied Fidelity went under. And I'd heard all kinds of horror stories about, how they had, just let anybody come in and write bonds, and they, that wasn't the reason they went under. They didn't have things fully secured. They were able to just write anybody that got in the way, and whatever their corporate oversight was, it wasn't working for their underwriting, and they ended up a lot of people that were doing it right still suffered the consequences of those
Oh,
smaller number of
absolutely.
people that were doing it wrong.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We like to think that we put the integrity of our company above profits. So we don't have to necessarily be number one in the country. We're satisfied where we're at, and we make a good living at it. And more importantly, we are able to provide the public with, I believe, a much needed product, and are able to sustain our commitments to the courts and to the states in backing up those agents.
Well, let's get into politics just a little bit. Kind of go large scale and then maybe drill down from there. During the last presidential election, I was trying to tell as many people as possible that the Biden written party platform was the abolition of secured bail. And most people didn't even know that this was the official party platform of the Democratic Party and Joe Biden specifically. Trump, on the other hand, seemed to be pro bail, but then Jared Kushner seemed fully bought into the concept of New York bail reform. And in the end, it seemed that Trump was, at least, if he wasn't pro bail, he wasn't necessarily anti bail in practice. He wasn't doing anything to harm us, but wasn't necessarily doing anything to promote the use of private bail. And it appears that your governor in Florida, Ron DeSantis, is getting a lot of buzz for the 2024 election. How should we as bail bondsmen feel about a DeSantis run? What has his position on bail been there in the state of Florida?
Well, I want you to understand, I'm a Democrat.
Okay.
But I agree with what you're saying. Governor DeSantis is a Republican. I would support Governor DeSantis over anyone that runs against him. He is pro bail. He does not believe in changing the bail system that we have here. And interestingly enough, if you saw the news interview that he had yesterday, I believe that he said that he ran across a sign that said, in reference to the Fort Myers hurricane aftermath, I believe he said that if you loot, we shoot. We're a Second Amendment state, and I agree with that. With the Second Amendment, and I agree with the Eighth Amendment, and I believe that Governor DeSantis stands very strongly in favor of both of those, and I will be one of the people voting for him, even though I know his opponent very well.
Well, how? As a Democrat, since that's not normally who I'm dealing with here in Kansas, we tend to be more of a red state. But how do we, either as on the Democratic side or the Republican side, sort of shift the Democratic Party away from this? I mean, if you're a Democrat, I can't imagine, and I'm not saying if you specifically, but generally as a Democrat in general, you can't help but think that this is damaging to the party brand, to be what is viewed by many as pro-criminal. I mean, anti-bail is seems to me like a pro-criminal position, although it's not being painted that way.
I agree with you. And all you have to look is the blue states that have gone with this notion that, anyone arrested should be released because, they're good people and give back to the social fabric of social workers. I think, well, let's blame the parents, let's blame society, let's blame everybody. And instead of saying, you broke the law, you pay the price, and hold them accountable for their actions. So I don't understand where the notion comes from that anyone that gets arrested should be released because they have no money. They don't have the means to get out because of that. We did several, Dr. Kroll, you referenced to earlier, made several studies here in Florida. And one of his conclusions was that there's no evidence to suggest that that people are staying in jail solely because they have no monetary means to get out. Now, if you pay attention to the Arnold Foundation and some of the other groups that are buying into the notion that everybody should be released, then I think they're misleading the public. And in every case that I've ever looked into, I've found that there's, and remember, my background was working with social welfare programs. I find that those studies are highly questionable. And I remember one in particular that I looked at here in Tampa when they were trying to start a pretrial release agency, and found that the doctor that was from California that had done the study had grouped sentenced people with non-sentenced people and said all of them are in there because they can't afford a bond. It wasn't true. Yet he had people believing it was true, merely because he had a doctorate's degree in criminology or whatever. But yes, there's this notion that people are languishing in jail solely because they can't get out is not true. Not in Florida.
I have kind of a funny anecdote for that. This bail reform panel that I participated in here a couple of weeks ago, before the group, one of the things that they'd laid out is they'd taken all the people that were in the Sedgwick County Jail, which was Wichita, and they identified that there were 457 of those people that were quote unquote bailable. And then, and the argument was that those 457 people, the only reason they're still in custody is because they can't afford to post bail. And, so then obviously in my role was to push back against that. And then I did reference the Los Angeles County study where they'd gone through and looked at that same type of thing. There were this many bailable people, what is Los Angeles County, so 12,000 bailable people or whatever it was. And then they'd gone through and, drilled down on that. And then turns out of all the people that were supposedly bailable, only 13% of those people would actually be released if they posted bond, because they had holes, they had detainers, they were, from Mexico, they were subject to immigration, they were going to go to prison someplace else. I mean, there were all kinds of reasons why they weren't actually walking out the door, even if they posted bond. And so to discuss that with these people, and a lot of times the people that are pushing this bail reform stuff, they really don't know anything about bail. And this was amply demonstrated in this meeting, because I said, okay, well, let's look at what we do. Because one of the things, we don't just go, okay, hey, you inmate, you have $100, we'll come down and get you right out. We always enlist some third party, some member of their family, their friends, their work coworkers, some part of their community support network that has to come down and take some degree of liability for that bond. So we have eyes on them in the community itself. So we don't just take the money and get them out and they walk out the door like it was a 10% bond. We're actually guaranteeing the full amount of the bond, and we're pulling in some third party to make that sort of guarantee. And that's how we filter people out to make sure that they are going to show up for court, that they have people that trust them, they have people in the community that support them. And so this lady's like, so if I want to get my nephew out, I have to come down and not only pay you, but I have to sign this contract. It's like, yes. And the response, and this was gold, it's just, well, what if I don't trust him to show up? It's like, well, you're making my point for me, lady.
That's right.
If you don't trust him to show up, that's one of the reasons why he's on that list of 400 plus people that are bailable but can't really get out, because the people they know won't come help them get out, because they know their people better than everybody else. And
to interrupting you here a minute, but you made a very interesting point. It doesn't necessarily that mom or dad or their aunt or uncles have to have money to back it. They just have to have the integrity in a lot of cases. And I've put bonds when I was in the retail side of it, $10,000, $20,000, because I knew grandma and I knew grandpa, and I knew that I had one time on a $10,000 bond. She brought her grandson and literally pulling him by the ear into my office because he failed to go to court. So did she have the 10,000? No, but her word with me was always good. And then her son, when she passed away, took over that role, and he was the same way, so the connection to the community is very important in our business. And that's a connection that the government doesn't have. So when they place someone on a pretrial program or whatever, they don't have that same connection. The other thing that's interesting, and I want to make a point of this, back in the 70s, the federal government had what they called LEA funds, and those funds helped create pretrial release programs across the country. And the reason behind them was that there were people that were languishing in jail that couldn't afford to get out because they had no money. So they created these programs, social programs. And guess what? Now we're, 30, 40 years later, and they're using the same argument again? Well, what happened to those programs? If they were working, we wouldn't have a problem. So if you look at it in that time span in the last 20 years, what was happening is surety bonds were increasing, and they were increasing because those programs weren't working, and they weren't working because the people that they had placed in the programs were failing to appear in court. So that notion doesn't make any sense to me. If the programs were created to take care of those that supposedly didn't have the means to get out, then why have we suddenly gone to the far left with it, thinking that it's going to work? You understand what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the classes, because I'm involved in our association, our continuing education. So every couple of years I get to give a presentation at our continuing education. And one of the first ones I did was history of bail. And so I talked about, the Bail Reform Act of 1966, where it had more lenient release built into it, and that sort of swept across the country. And then what you saw was the violent crime rate from basically 1967 on more than tripled until the late 80s, early 90s. And that was essentially about the same time that the Bureau of Justice Statistics report on pretrial release came out, the 1992 report that showed the failure to appear rates based on differing types of bonds. And surety bonds had the lowest failure to appear rate. And so what you then saw was an increase, and you had more people using, or more court systems using non-monetary, non-financial release during the 70s and 80s than you had using surety releases. And that's I think it was, 40% were being released non-financial, and 30% were released on some sort of financial condition, including surety bail. After that 92 report, you saw a shift in that, where basically it was now about 40% of people were being released on surety bonds or some sort of financial release, and about 30% were being released on non-financial conditions. And what you saw was that crime rate begin to taper off. And it obviously corresponded with other things as well. Bill Clinton's 100,000 officers on the street, and some of those other anti-crime measures that were taken at the time. And you saw bail increase, and you saw crime drop. The use of secured bail increase and crime drop. And now you're basically back on that 1960s cycle again, where you're getting all these lenient releases, and you're starting to see this rapid uptick in crime. And because it's the same people that are committing crimes over and over and over again.
Well, and the system became even more liberal as far as the release policies. And once you start mandating to judges that they have to release someone that's arrested, and you take away the discretionary power that they have, you can only expect the criminal element to take full advantage of that. And they are. And if you see the news media, and some of the news medias, not all of them are reporting it, you see the horrific abuses that are taking place, and they're being taken place because those guys that are committing those crimes know that nothing is going to happen to them. And they go back out, they get arrested, they're out the next day, they don't have to answer to anyone. I'll tell you, with the bail people that I know, one of the first things they tell a client is, now you can't get in any more trouble, you can't commit any more crimes, and go to work.
Yeah, got to stay away from the victim.
And stay away from the victim. Yeah.
Well, let's move a little bit here, kind of on the same vein. But at that bail reform panel, that I participated in, I tried to point out that doing away with bail means we also have to look at what comes after that. What are the alternatives to bail? And in my mind, there were basically three options. There was one, release everybody. And we'll talk about Illinois in a second, and we're going to get to see what happens there. You have the second option, which the federal system has gone to, which is preventative detention, which is don't release anybody. You lock everybody up. And so all these arguments about the presumption of innocence, those all go out the window when you're talking about we're just going to preventatively detain people. Or the third option is this huge expansion of taxpayer-funded pretrial release programs, or some combination of the three. Basically preventive detention with pretrial release programs, which is sort of what they've done in New Jersey, and those are ridiculously expensive as well. Now, as we mentioned before, there's a study on your website, on the Roche Surety website, by Dr. David Crowell, who is a PhD in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Tampa. And the subtitle of that study is called "A Case for the Continued Use of Surety Bonding as a Cost-Containing Mechanism for Secured Pretrial Release." Now, I don't think anybody, in general, there's some small subset of people that want to release everybody. And like I said, we'll see what happens on that in Illinois, but I don't think that's what everybody wants. When the bill passed in New Mexico that allowed all these releases, it was sold as a preventative detention bill. We could lock up the worst, and we wouldn't have to deal with this other stuff. So there's a large subset of the population that supports not letting anybody go, and so that's the preventive detention. And I don't think a lot of people, particularly on the left, really want to see preventive detention, because that then locks up everybody else. The racial component of areas that have done that, you're locking up more Black and brown people in a preventive detention release system than you are under a classic surety bail system. So then it becomes an issue of, do we do the massively funded pretrial release program? And I think Dr. Crowell was kind of pushing back against that. Can you talk about that study some?
Is that the study that he did in 2021, or?
I think it's the 2019 study. It may have been updated then. That generally was talking about, I think the state of Florida had saved over $400 million by using surety bail.
Yes. What happened is that I had been in a safety council meeting, and the pretrial release people were trying to fund a pretrial program in Tampa and Hillsborough County, and they were saying how much money they were saving the people of Hillsborough County by these individuals not being detained in their jail on a daily basis. Well, I went back and spoke to Dr. Crowell, and I said, David, his name's David Crowell. I said, there's something wrong here. I said, because if you take that formula and you apply it to the people that are being bonded out at no cost to the taxpayer, and multiply that daily cost by the number of days that are being released, then we would have saved a great deal more. And I said, I've checked with 4 of my agencies, and that amount would have been over $60 million versus 14 million. And that's part of the offshoot of that study that he did. But what we went back to that safety council meeting and presented what I just told you, and the authors of the original statement said, "Oh, no, wait a minute, where did you get that from?" And I said, "Well, we got it from your own formula. You guys used that formula at this last meeting." So what they were doing is they were multiplying the cost per day of someone that is incarcerated from that time, the time of arrest, to the time they're released. And they were multiplying it by that daily cost. Well, if you use the same formula, we get you out, you're on day 1, and your case takes 10 months. Well, that's a lot of days that we have saved the taxpayers money. So that whole notion at the time just fell through, and David Crowell's study was a big factor in convincing people that wasn't the route to go.
Well, and those sorts of studies, I mean, it's good to use their own numbers against them on those things, but my argument on those types of studies has been that strikes me as government math.
My problem, and I've been studying these things since the 60s, these studies that they've made. My problem is the out and out lies that perpetuate with these studies that are groundless. And then they look, they try to bring the statistics to support their agenda. And then when you look behind it, you see, well, wait a minute, their agenda is wrong, but also the method that they used to obtain that agenda is wrong. And I'll give you an example. In an Arnold study that was done, I have personal knowledge that this took place. There was individuals in jail for charges that they could not get out, but they would have, say, for a charge of driving with license suspended. The sheriff was asked to ignore the principal charge, which was the felony, and allow them to put the minor charge, which was with driving with license suspended, as their study of the reason that they were being in jail. So they were ignoring one and using the other, the driving with license suspended, to substantiate their position. And this particular sheriff had the integrity of saying, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to report it the way it's supposed to be reported. He is in jail because he's awaiting a felony assault charge, not because he's in, he had a hole on that charge and couldn't have got out anyway. But that kind of manipulation of the data is what really concerns me. And the other thing that concerns me is they use federal dollars in many cases to support that.
And you would think if you lie in your federal studies that there should be some sort of consequences to that.
You would think so.
You mentioned, the basically falsehoods in these studies, and I have some direct experience with that myself. But we've seen that in New Jersey as well, where New Jersey then turns around and redefines what it means to fail to appear. I mean, they would, and this is a point that I try and make in things is.
Well, let me add to that New Jersey scenario. One of my vice presidents of our company, Ken Burke, has attempted to get statistical information from the system players in New Jersey and has not been able to do that. And he hasn't been able to do that because they literally refuse to give him the information. Now, why would you refuse, if your program is working so well, to give someone the information that's needed? Well, because it's not working well and you want to hide it. And if you look at Ken Burke's efforts in that direction, you're hitting your head up against the wall with people that should be willing to freely provide that information to anyone. In some cases, we're being told, well, we don't have to give you that. Well, no, you don't have to. But as a public servant, don't you think you should? So, taxpayer costs in New Jersey, I understand, may be approaching $1 billion since they started this program in 2017. And if you look at the data from the New Jersey Criminal Justice Reform Information Center that they've put out there, there's more people now in jail that are being held there than before they started it. Right. We lost 17 agencies in New Jersey when they started that program. And those agencies were self-sufficient. They didn't cost the taxpayers any money, but it did not meet with a particular judge's narrative of what he thought the criminal justice system should look like.
Well, it is a problem when the judges have a vested interest in the outcome of these programs, when they support them, then you're in the position where the judges have reason, particularly if they're elected, but even if they're not, have reason to, at the very least, obfuscate the results of the programs that they've enacted, which is terrible. I mean, the judges should be more like referees, calling balls and strikes and that sort of thing, than the people that want to make the rules of the game. And when it doesn't work out like they want it to, well, we'll just kind of won't tell you went wrong with that.
But Shane, let me tell you, I first saw some of this back in '77. I was looking for a girl that had jumped bond here in Tampa. I'm on K Street in Washington, D.C. And I come across a police officer, and I show him a picture of the girl, tell him what she's wanted for, and that I had a warrant to bring her back. And he tells me, he says, if you arrest her in the district, I'm going to arrest you for doing that. And as I looked up across the street, I see a guy that's about to shoot. He's got a rubber band tied around his arm, and he's getting a needle, and he's going to shoot what I presume were drugs into his arm. And I said, officer, look at that guy. He said, what guy? I said, the one across the street. Look at him. He says, I don't see him. I said, look at him. He's got a rubber band tied around his arm, and he's getting ready to shove a needle in his arm. He says, you don't understand. If I don't see it, it's not happening. And that's what you're seeing across the country with some of our news media. They're not reporting it, so they're not seeing it. And the one or two medias that are showing it, unfortunately, I don't think enough people in the country are watching it. But that's kind of where we're at today. If they don't see it, they don't feel that it's something they should report. The crime doesn't take place.
Well,
or you see these prosecutors that are deciding what should be a crime and what shouldn't be a crime. And what's a major crime and what's a minor crime? Well, that's not their position. It's not their job. Their job is to prosecute those people that break the law.
Was the DA that Governor DeSantis suspended, was that in Tampa, or was that south of Tampa?
Hillsborough County.
That was Hillsborough County.
And I can tell you that he personally told me that he's not in favor of this cash bonding.
In the news recently, and we'll switch gears just a little bit here.
By the way, before you continue, let me bring attention to the fact that we lost one of our police officers in Polk County this morning. He was serving a warrant. I believe he was 21 years old. He was serving a warrant when he was killed. It happened in Polk County. I'm sure you've heard of Sheriff Judd, and it's one of his men was killed.
And that's the tragic part of what's going on here is, and not just police officers, but I mean just the general public. I mean, would they report that there were 40,000 murders in the United States, or 40,000 firearms deaths in the United States last year, and that's up 10,000 from 2 years ago.
Yes.
That's tied directly into lenient criminal justice enforcement.
That and a total disrespect for law enforcement. I would have never thought that our country would come to the level of lack of respect for our law enforcement, our teachers that we're at today. It's terrible, and it's going to get worse. It's like the child that steals that candy. If you don't turn around and take them back and return it, and you're condoning the theft of that one candy, it's going to lead to other things.
Well, yeah, and that's the point where I think Ken Good, actually in a panel that I watched, we said that misdemeanor crime was the training ground for felony crimes, and
Absolutely.
Of course he was booed on the stage for that, but it's absolutely accurate. You don't start off going out and robbing a bank. You start off with these other minor crimes, and if you don't push back against those minor crimes, they lead to bigger things. Let's kind of swing over to Harris County, which is where that was. And that was just in the news here. The Arnold Foundation basically bought and paid for a study that tries to claim that everything is fine in Harris County, there's no problems. That the only reasons were that the hurricane and COVID has kind of thrown things out of sorts.
The 81% failure to appear rate on their misdemeanors, let's not count those.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing, and I want to bring your attention to it, I don't know if you remember back in the 80s in California, they had an experiment there with misdemeanor bonds. And what they did is they ROR'd the misdemeanor bonds and not the felonies, but in the hopes that the felonies would come later. The problem that they had was the failure appear rate for those that were released on the misdemeanors was probably very close to, if not more than, the Harris County study. And at the end of that year, 2-year period, the state of California at the time decided not to go with that program.
Yeah, they
And
allowed it to sunset.
Celeste King was one of the people that he's passed away now, but he was the second president that PBUS had, was instrumental in doing the studies that proved that those misdemeanor releases weren't working.
Well,
So I guess it depends on the system that the citizens of a particular area. Mary Tolberg did a study in the 80s that said that it's whatever a particular political group wants to do that really determines the outcome of that area and just how the criminal justice system works.
well, and let's talk about a particular area and kind of touch base on Illinois here. I mean, Illinois' no bail releases are coming in January. At that bail reform panel I sat on, well, one of the anti-bail people was claiming that Illinois had abolished its cash bail system with no ill effects, and I kind of had to point out that hasn't really taken effect yet. We're going to see what the ill effects are come January.
But here's the distinction between Illinois and say Florida. Florida has surety bail and cash, but Illinois only has, Chicago only uses 10%.
Right.
So it's not even the full amount of the bail. And interestingly enough, I'm going to make you a prediction. Crime there is going to get worse if this system takes place.
Well, I agree. And this is one of the things I'm looking at future-wise, you know, that this experiment, and this is just an experiment with people's lives as the guinea pigs, that it'll go one of three ways. One, if it fails as badly as we expect, and I think we can, you know, given what we've seen in the last couple of years, we can see that that's going to happen, but we could be wrong. It will either be a nail in the coffin for bail reform as a whole. I mean, it'll be just, I mean, it's the second largest city in the country. And you know, if it just implodes, you know, the news media can't just completely ignore that, you would hope. But if for some reason, you know, it actually works, crime doesn't spike, you know, defendants actually show up for court, which, you know, as we've seen, isn't going to happen, then it'll cause other states to turn away from secured bail. Or three, it'll fail. But the people responsible will cover it up. Basically, they'll try and gaslight the country like we've seen them try and do in Houston. I mean, I listened to the judges or read the judge's statement following Ken Good's analysis of the 80% failure to appear rate. And it wasn't anything really refuting the facts. It was just, oh, you know, trying to interfere, you know, these evil bondsmen trying to, you know, protect their interests. So I really do think, even though there's no bondsman involved and it's difficult for us to push back on things in Illinois because there are no bondsmen, I think it's really going to be critical for us to watch and see what happens in this, because I mean, this is just wholesale, let everybody, you know, out and see what happens sort of thing. I mean,
you want to see that escalate even further than what you're talking about? Take the gun away from the average law-abiding citizen. And those figures are going to multiply 3 and 4 times what they currently are, because the criminal is going to get that gun, and the guy who goes to work every day and he's a guy that's going to be beaten as he walks out his door. And the only thing that keeps that from happening now is the fact that he could have a gun,
right,
and legally carry it. Fortunately, in Florida, we do have that. And I don't know. I know Illinois has fought it for a number of years, but I think it would compound and exacerbate the problem much further than we have it right now.
Well, let's sort of wrap it up here and give you a chance to do a little prognostication here. I don't mean this to be as a criticism for Roche, because it's really not. But one of the scariest moments to me in the last couple of years was, as we're going through all this, was when I saw that Roche, and you probably have already done this, but was expanding its coverage lines to include insurance for notaries and other types of performance bonds. Now, you've probably already been doing that for a long, long time. It just happened to pop up that you were promoting that. And I remember thinking to myself, man, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry.
This is just my takeaway from it. But
there's 2 companies. One is Roche Surety and Casualty Company. that only does bail. It only guarantees bail bonds. The other one is the managing general agency, which is the one that actually is the managing general agent for other companies that do notary bonds and surety contract bonds and that type of
Right.
thing. But our insurance company only does bail.
Okay.
We don't.
So I don't have to be worried that Roche was pivoting away from bail then, because that was sort of a scary moment at the time.
No. Listen, I've been a bail bondsman too long. I have no desire of taking that company in another direction. Now, it is a property casualty company. It could go in another direction, but I owe my allegiance to my agents. I feel that I'm one of them. I've represented them for years, and I can assure you that I have, as long as I live, no intention of doing that. And by the way, I just want to mention that my daughter is president of the company. She's been a bail agent for over 30 years. My niece is the compliance officer for the company. And one of my grandsons, my oldest grandson, is a vice president of the company. So we have a familial commitment to this industry.
I wish you all a long and prosperous life then. What, because that's to my benefit as well. So what do you see future-wise going forward? I know we have fights coming up, but does it seem like we've sort of turned the corner by, how poorly these things have been going, or does it seem like we're still on the ropes?
I believe that we're going to be on the ropes as long as we're in this business and it's not legally abolished. I think that the left is so far convinced that they're right, that they don't want to listen to the truth. Some of them I've asked some and they've turned around and said, well, I don't have to answer that question. I don't have to tell you where my figures come from. What is this? You're government supported, you're taxpayer supported, and you don't feel like you have to answer to the public. I really believe that everybody that's in this industry should commit themselves to the fight to keep it alive. And all we're saying is, don't take away the judge's discretion to use bail and surety, particularly surety bonds or cash bonds, as one of the alternatives to get out of jail. That's all. Well, they want to tell judges how to operate their courtrooms. And that's, I think, a terrible mistake for the citizens of this country.
Well, hopefully that, we'll start to see a little bit of turnaround. I mean, the numbers clearly support the arguments we're making. I mean, the study you referenced where the law in California was allowed to sunset, where they let everybody go. I specifically remember a quote at the end of that from one of the legislatures who said, it certainly looks like the right people were staying in jail under the old system. And, and basically, right. Oh, I agree.
But that occurred because judges were making those decisions. It wasn't bail bonds. So we don't make that decision. That we don't make the decision as to who gets bond or not. A judge makes that decision, and a judge has to answer to the public, for his actions.
Well, some places.
Some places, yeah. But I think that's where you saw the trend that we were speaking about earlier, that they were leaning more to surety bonds than the ROR. I know a judge that literally threw the ROR people out of his courtroom down in South Florida. He was from Fort Lauderdale, because they were lying to him. And he told me, he says, I just told them they were not allowed in my courtroom anymore. But of course, that was a very radical decision as far as the ultra liberals were concerned, and they were constantly on this judge because of it. But he was right. If you come into my courtroom and you lie to me, I'm not going to permit you to do that.
Well, I have noticed that over time, the longer a judge is on the bench, the more they've seen and heard this same story over and over again. And
absolutely,
the more likely they are to set some sort of secured bail. One of the hanging judges in my district who retired here a few years ago, when he first came in, we brought some guy in that we'd had to dig out of the attic underneath the insulation that if you do miss court, and he turned around the following day and gave him a signature bond. And of course, the guy immediately failed to appear again. And when he got caught again after that, the judge, you see that stuff happen. That happens to you enough times that you're like, yeah, I don't think we're going to go this route. But you do, you're always having, judges are only on the bench for 10 or 15 years at most. And so they're always being cycled back out again, and then you've got to go through that same learning curve with every new judge that comes along.
Absolutely. It's a very fluid industry, and you have to constantly adapt to it. But I tell you, thank goodness for people like David Stuckman in Kansas, Topo Padilla in California, Mary Smith in Ohio, Mike Harrison in Florida, who's the president of the Florida Association. Those folks have taken up the mantle of the older guys, me, okay, and someone like you that have taken up this mantle and are fighting back, because it's a fight we're going to have to continue as long as we're in this business.
Yeah, it's a year in, year out sort of thing.
Yeah. And by the way, I do want to make one more statement. Our current vice president, while she was in the Senate, placed a bill in the Senate to eliminate the monetary bail. In the House, I believe it was Ted Lieu, congressman, who introduced a similar bill. So she is in favor of eliminating the monetary bail system.
Oh, absolutely. And quite frankly, I think she should have been impeached as the Attorney General of California when she refused to, uphold California law in the Buffin lawsuit. That's her job as Attorney General, to defend state laws, whether she likes them or not to basically use, I'm now the Attorney General and I just get to veto laws by just letting somebody sue the state and walk away from it. So, but they elected her senator after that. So what do I know?
And then vice president.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's a fight, and we'll have to keep fighting it up. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. I really appreciate, the information and the background, and obviously the enormous history you bring to this. You've been fighting this fight longer than anybody. And, I know that I was talking to one of my old competitors who just passed away. He had done this as well, and he was back up at the legislature in the 70s, and back when they were trying to roll over bail to PR bonds, or what we call PR bonds, or signature bonds, and everybody, and he was instrumental in the fight against there. So we can't forget, even although I'm a lot older than I was, we can't forget the people that came before us and the reason we're still in business here. So I do thank you for all the efforts you've done, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the kind words.
Thank you for joining us today on the Bail in the Midwest podcast.